everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening, and welcome to this evening's discussion about the impact of Brexit on BAME communities. My name is Debbie Weeks-Bernard. I am the very new Deputy Mayor of London for Social Integration, Social Mobility, Community Engagement. This is the 4th day of my new role, starting on Monday. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you this evening. I'm particularly excited because I have a very warm and long-standing relationship with Rota. And this is actually my very first speaking engagement since taking on my post. And I'm particularly glad that my first speaking engagement is talking on issues to do with race equality and tackling some of the inequalities that many people from minority ethnic and migrant backgrounds are currently experiencing in the UK. So we've got a very full and very exciting programme of discussion this evening. I was told recently that I am the first black female deputy mayor ever of London, and the reason that that is so exciting is because I think it's actually really important to talk about some of those representational issues, some of those problems with decision making that often can impact negatively on particular communities. And so I hope that in my role, for as long as it lasts, I'm able to make sorts of decisions and to have the sorts of impact and discussions that can impact positively on communities from vulnerable groups, low-income groups, minority ethnic groups, and other groups reflected across all the equality strands. Now, this issue is a very important issue. The EU referendum was a very divisive referendum, and the discussions that continue to rage around it continue to be very divisive. And what's very interesting about the briefing that Rota have produced and that we'll be hearing more about this evening is that it shines a light on the impact on particular communities. And in doing so, it raises some of the issues that don't often get talked about in the political debate about Brexit. We talk about borders, we often talk about the impact on trade, but we don't talk about the impact that it's likely to have on some of our most vulnerable communities across the UK and also here in London. One of the things that I'm deeply interested in as the Deputy Mayor, and I don't want to keep ranting on because it's not about me today, is the impact that many political decisions can have on people from low-income groups. And I'm very, very concerned about trying to tackle poverty. There are too many people from minority ethnic backgrounds who are living in poverty in the UK. We have a poverty rate of around 20% in the UK, yet half of people from Bangladeshi descent are living in poverty. And the disproportionality that impacts upon those communities is something which is clearly of concern. The reason that I raise this here in this forum is that we don't know at the moment what impact Brexit is likely to have on those communities. And what the briefing clearly shows is that for those communities who are already suffering financially or having a particularly negative experience of the UK, there is we can perhaps suggest that Brexit can have a potentially further negative impact on their lives and exacerbate some of the negativities and the inequalities that they're already experiencing. But we've got a really interesting set of discussions to have. The debate hopefully will be challenging and will be interesting. Each of our presenters are going to talk for 10 minutes each, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce both Kimberly and Miriam to come to the front and talk about their research. Thank you.
So, welcome everyone to Resource for London, and thank you for coming today. Please spare a thought for us because this is our second presentation of this today. And last minute, when completing the briefing, we had a draft withdrawal agreement dropped, so we had to redo the beginning. We know that Brexit has been synonymous with uncertainty, but we've been living that definitely over the past week. But what we've seen from Brexit so far has been a distraction that the negotiations have presented us with, which has been detrimental to the long-term goals of reducing economic disadvantage, not just for BME people, but for everyone on low incomes and people with protected characteristics too. But ethnic minorities face particular challenges in the labour market. BAME communities have more formal qualifications than ever before, but we're not seeing this translating in the workplace. We know that 40% of African and 39% of Bangladeshi graduates are overqualified for their roles. And BAME people face lower pay, higher rates of unemployment, concentration in specific low-paid industries, face pay gaps, insecure working conditions, and the unemployment rate, which is at 3% for white women and white men, is at 7% for black women and black men. And as Debbie mentioned already, the poverty rate is at 50% for Bangladeshi households, and also we have a 60% child poverty rate for Pakistani children at the moment, which is outrageously high. And we don't know what Brexit is going to bring and how that's going to impact on those poverty rates. How are those families going to be able to have the resilience to deal with the changes that are at the moment still unforeseen? We know that ethnic minorities have less in assets, and as a result of that have to spend a high proportion of their income on rent, and because of that have less savings. So this leaves BME people in a very vulnerable position to the economic risks of Brexit, which we're not sure what they may look like, but we've been able to, based on the projections that have been made, to try and make some assumptions that Ira's going to discuss.
So thank you, Kim. So the first thing to mention here is that in the briefing that you all hopefully have with you, we go further into methodology that I'm not going to go into here, as that tells you how we came to our conclusions. Also note that we have not been able to cover all the variation within and between BME groups in the UK. That's a mammoth task, and our briefing wasn't able to cover that, so please bear that in mind. So, firstly, there's a strong evidence that a no-deal or hard Brexit would be the most damaging for BAME communities, women and those on low income with few qualifications. So the government should avoid these scenarios at all costs. So what do I mean by that? The predicted drop in national GDP, productivity and employment in many sectors and potential increase in trade barriers due to Brexit will have negative consequences for the entire country. Just today, Theresa May, just an hour ago, in the draft declaration that will jointly be released with the EU, said that the EU and the UK will be separate markets and distinct legal orders. So this will not be the frictionless trade that was promised in the Chequers Agreement. There will be some form of barriers once the transition period has finished. So what does this mean? BAME workers who are already disadvantaged by institutional racism and discrimination they face will be additionally impacted by a weakening economy and a hostile trade environment. BAME women, who make up 80% of the residential care and social work workforces and are highly concentrated within human health and social work, are likely to face these sectors are likely to face higher operational costs, tighter budgets, greater performance pressures on staff, not to mention the possibility of huge redundancies. South Asian workers are concentrated in sectors such as clothing manufacture, retail, hotel work, restaurants and textiles, with traditionally lower pay and higher job insecurity. These already low-paid workers are at risk of even lower pay and greater insecurity because of downsizing or relocation of firms due to Brexit. Those with temporary casual employment status or 0 hours contracts are most at risk of gradually eroded employment standards and minimum wage protections, despite the possibility of a short-term temporary increase in labour due to departing EU workers. So we know that in the case of a hard Brexit, there will be increased barriers to trade, whether in the form of new tariffs or high non-tariff barriers such as customs checks and regulatory divergence. Thank you. Where were we?
Regulatory divergence.
Thank you. Regulatory divergence.
Someone's listening.
That will affect sectors that heavily rely on export to the EU and the industries that supply them, as well as those that get their inputs from the EU. So in the case of a no-deal Brexit and the imposition of WTO rules, which is still a huge possibility, these will lead to tariff-based barriers within the EU. Many industries and sectors will face falls in productivity and value. BAME populations of regions who are employed in manufacture and export-based industries will face economic uncertainty, rising costs of production, and increased global competition. Men employed in highly exposed sectors in the West Midlands and in the North in general are most at the risk of downsizing due to trade barriers. So as part of its industrial strategy, we call on the government to ensure that people have the skills needed to move into new industries and provide them with a robust social security system to support those who cannot. And as far as we can see, there has been no planning of this kind under consideration during the Brexit talks, and a huge lack of impact assessment. And I'm going to quickly run you through some potential impacts of changes in the prices of household goods and services that are going to disproportionately impact BAME families. So BAME families are less likely to have savings. They spend a greater share of their income overall, and are less able to weather economic hardships than their white counterparts. This makes them sensitive to changes in the prices of goods post-Brexit. Bangladeshi, Black African and Pakistani households are more likely than other groups to have dependent children and live in larger families. For Black groups, single-parent families are more common than in other groups. BAME households are much more likely to receive top-ups to their wages from working tax credits and help with housing costs in the form of housing benefit and local housing allowance. So what does this mean? If prices go up, especially of food, this could mean that families are worse off. Around 30% of the food purchased in the UK is imported from the EU, and this will be greatly impacted by the nature of post-Brexit trade agreements. The poorest families would be the most impacted by rising food prices, as almost a quarter of their household expenditure goes on food. Areas outside of London have experienced the largest inflation effects after the referendum, and it is likely that the poorest BAME populations in these areas will be the most impacted. So, while a soft Brexit is the most desirable income, and that's what the withdrawal agreement is promising us, even this scenario is predicted to be harmful to BAME families overall, given the 2% depreciation in the value of the sterling and a predicted 1.8% reduction in income. Now, what does this mean? The average household is already £600 to £1,000 poorer since Brexit, and the combination of increased tariffs under WTO rules and the fall in the value of the pound and the fall in productivity can lead to a decline in household income between £850 at the lower end of the scale to up to £6,400 a year at the higher end of the scale, with those in the lowest deciles being the worst hit. BAME families across the country will now be less able to afford the same but now more expensive baskets of goods and services. These impacts will be most felt by BAME women, as they tend to have the main responsibility for the purchase and preparation of food and management of the household budget. They have been described as a shock absorbers of poverty, as they bear the brunt of its worst effect while seeking to protect their families from it. I hope this has given you a quick sketch of what Brexit for BAME families could look like.
So we don't know how the government is going to respond in our new post-Brexit future, but we can get some ideas when we look at the budget that came out in October. And we were told that austerity was ending, and now we've been told it's coming to an end. And I'm not excellent with grammar, but I can tell the difference between something that's definitely coming to an end and something that maybe is when there isn't a deadline. So austerity definitely isn't ending. And when we look at the budget, if this is any kind of litmus test as to how the government might respond to rising inequality, then we can see that austerity is going to continue. So we know that there has been a £1,000 increase promised to the work allowance, and that's great for particularly black single mothers who are being really penalised by universal credit because it's more favourable to people living in a couple. But that alone isn't going to undo 8 years of austerity. So we know that an increase to the personal tax allowance tends to favour wealthier people, particularly wealthier men. We haven't seen an increase in working age benefits. There's still a 2-child cap as part of child tax credit. So we're not seeing enough change, and we're definitely not seeing enough investment in public services to make up for 8 years of cuts either. We've been promised £650 million by 2019-20 for social care, but the King's Fund have said that we need 1.5 billion by 2020, so that clearly isn't going to be enough to make up the shortfalls that our services are facing. And we know from research that the Women's Budget Group did last year with the Runnymede Trust of how austerity has already impacted BME communities unfairly. And we know that the poorest Black and Asian women have lost between 19 and 20% in living standards. if the government doesn't change track from 2010 until 2020, that's the drop that we have seen and that we will see, which is equivalent to 8,000 to 10,000 per year, respectively, for black and Asian women. So we're seeing significant losses, and we're not seeing enough change proposed in the budget to make up for those losses. And this is all going on the belief that there won't be an emergency budget if we have no deal. So we've had Philip Hammond switching and saying, if we have no deal, we'll have an emergency budget. Actually, I take it back, that's not true, we're not going to do that anymore, this is what's going to happen. But there's so much uncertainty that we don't see anything laid out clearly that shows that not only that the needs of BME people and BME households will be taken into account, but that the austerity programme that we already have is going to come to an end in any way and stop hitting these families the hardest. And on top of that, to make things worse, we know that BME people are also the most vulnerable group in terms of hate crime, because as visible minorities. So there's some great research by Hope Not Hate, and I can see Rosie's actually in the audience, but everyone should read it. It's really, really great research. But it's also very worrying and scary research and findings. And what they found was that the levels of optimism about economic prosperity after leaving the European Union is the highest in the areas that most strongly voted to leave the EU. But these are also the areas that are projected to be negatively impacted by a hard Brexit. So we've got a situation where people genuinely believe that their lives will improve for them and also for their children. And when that doesn't happen, there's a real risk that the resentment that may come from that will once again manifest and be targeted at ethnic minorities again, and migrants in general, and anyone who's visibly different. And there's evidence that the police are already preparing for that increase coming in March 2019. And in March 2016, when we left, we saw the largest ever recorded increase in hate crime ever. So based upon that, and the rhetoric of the Leave campaign, which kind of gave sanction to this behaviour, I think if we have politicians and we have a government and an opposition which aren't really offering an alternative that's inspiring, that are ignoring real economic and social grievances that have built up for a really long time, and the only other vision on the table is fanning division and making pleas to an exclusionary form of English identity, we're looking at a very scary and worrying future. And I read today that Hillary Clinton has written a Guardian article saying that what we need to do to stop populism is actually to limit migration, which just shows to me that she's not read the research clearly, but she needs to, because I don't think that they've learned if you're only offering a rhetoric that's anti-migration, you're offering nothing else, that an economic status quo, nothing will change. And I should have been ending on some kind of positive note here. But I think there's a lot of work to do, and we've all got a lot of work to do.
So I know that I mentioned this earlier, but just in closing, I'd like to say that we know that in our report we weren't able to take an in-depth look at lots of different sorts of minority populations in the UK, including Commonwealth citizens, so non-EU born migrants, and hopefully our panellists will be able to give us a little more of that flavour that we haven't been able to go into our report, including on Roma communities and Latin American communities in the UK.
Okay, thank you so much to Kimberly and Kieran for a really interesting summary of research that I welcome you all to read in detail. And it sets us up nicely for our first panellist response. Femi Oloroyle from Our Future, Our Choice, and he will make the case for the people's vote and the potential impact of Brexit on young people.
Okay, so I created Our Future, Our Choice along with a couple of other people, Laura, Will, Callum, last year. At the start of this year, but I started campaigning on this in 2016, in January, when I realised that David Cameron wasn't giving us the facts that we needed to make that decision. Didn't bother to explain the single market, which was basically the economic benefit of being in the EU. In fact, it was only 2 weeks ago that I had to go on a Twitter rant against the BBC because their definition of the single market on their website was wrong. and they changed it 2 days later. The BBC, 2 years after the Brexit vote, does not understand the economic benefit of being in the EU. That's the situation we're currently in. And you heard just then a bunch of facts about the damage that would be done to the economy in relation to Brexit and the various options. But it's very, very hard to convince people about the damage because you haven't explained why there'd be damage. So I'm just going to explain the single market just in a couple of seconds. Imagine if you wanted to sell a product to 28 different countries, but those countries had different rules. Let's say beer, as a random example. One country says it has to have this amount of alcohol, the one country says it has to have this or this ingredient, and so forth. You'd have to manufacture, market, and package your product in 28 different ways, which would rain hell on your costs, would raise your prices. By making laws together as 28 countries, which is what the single market is, you need to make one version of your product and it's legal across the board with no regulatory checks, no customs barriers, nothing like that. That's the economic benefit. And any business that's in that has an economic benefit over businesses that are outside of that. That was the context regarding that. And there's also the moral context in terms of, I was working for an NGO in Brussels that focused on the focused on the exploitation of migrant workers, which was ironic because they paid me 150 euros a month. But they also focused on human rights issues in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. And let's just say our relations with those countries isn't ideal. We've been training the military that's been committing human rights violations. We've been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which we're using to commit war crimes in Yemen. And we were pressuring the EU to pressure the, countries such as our own to do the right thing and stop facilitating these problems. And then for me, from my perspective as somebody who's passionate about human rights, to then see that Theresa May, somebody who wanted to get rid of the Human Rights Act, that Brexit became a thing. And so in 2016, at the start of that, I realized, okay, I have to start actually campaigning on this. Because countries, when they're in desperate positions, do bad stuff. And one of the reasons why the EU was actually created was because of that principle. Human rights, it was born after, the origins of the EU was the European Coal and Steel Community, which came about 7 years after the end of the Second World War. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that came about just shortly after the Second World War as well, because we needed to make sure that A, our economies were intertwined enough so that we'd never go to war with each other, and B, that there were at least some principles to make sure that people were protected from their governments, because that's what human rights are about. And that's one of the major things that's at risk regarding Brexit, the fact that we lose that supranational protection on human rights in favour of, the first thing that Theresa May planned to do after the Brexit vote was to scrap corporation tax, basically to make the UK a more attractive place for businesses. Because that's what the priority is going to be. It's going to be on basically facilitating business, and people at the bottom will be the ones that suffer. Now, regarding the narrative and minorities and the xenophobia, for me, it's terrifying in the sense that A, there's the loss of moral protection that the EU provides, but also they very much tipped their hand with the racist rhetoric that was used during the referendum. And I want to be really clear on this. The referendum campaign, the Brexit campaign, had strong elements of racism, but that does not mean that Brexit voters are racist. Let's be really, really clear on that one, because we've been wrong, we've been very, very not accurate with our use of that word. But if you stand in front of a poster that shows thousands of Syrians and say breaking point, when in fact the UK is not part of the EU's common asylum policy, which means that not one of those people could have come to this country without our say-so anyway, but the people you're choosing to point to say, look at the people the EU is forcing on us, just happen to be of brown skin because they're the people you think your target audience will be most afraid of, that's categorically racist. And they actually tipped their hand on this one. Because as I mentioned, the only people who have a right to come here under EU law are people like Polish people or Bulgarians, people who look like Nigel Farage, but, I know it's a scary thought, but yeah. And they showed the people that they actually want to target, which is people who look more different, which shows where they're going with this. People often say, just let Brexit happen, give the far right their victory, that'll make them, otherwise Farage will get back on his soapbox. But you've heard the poem, so stop me when I get there. First they came for the socialists, I said nothing because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came, I'm going to butcher this poem. Then they came for the Catholic, I said nothing because I wasn't a Catholic. And then they came for me, and there was no one to speak for me, and they took it. I've got it wrong, but you get the point. This is their first, Brexit is just the first step, it's not their end goal. Things will get worse after that once they realise they've taken back control and now the country now belongs to them. They've made Britain great again, whatever slogan you want to pick. So, regarding how we move forward, the various options you heard about no deal being bad for the economy and bad for ethnic minorities. A softer Brexit, or the deal that's been presented today, which is the other option presented this week, that's also bad as well. Because if we end up with less control over our laws, which is what this deal does, that's why they're so angry about it. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg says it makes us a slave state. And that feeling of needing to take back control, that's going to be even worse. And that feeling that the country doesn't belong to them, and that sort of feeling, that's going to be even worse. And it's going to be BAME communities that suffer as a result of that. Okay, back to young people in general. Young people strongly against Brexit. The fact that I was able to take it to Nigel Farage several times in terms of, I called him up on his phone, got him to admit live on air, A, that EU members can control immigration, but the UK simply chose not to. B, that citizens from EU countries make up 5% of our population and 10% of our doctors, so we desperately rely on immigration to literally keep us alive. And this is a millennial making the guy who's responsible for Brexit completely go back on every single thing he said about immigration beforehand. Young people have every right to get involved in this, and that's why our future, our choice was created, to make the point that this is about our futures. We need to make sure that we're not led down a path led by Nigel Farage into something that will be deeply, deeply harmful to our country.
Thank you, Tony, for that rousing presentation. I'm now going to pass over to Camille, who's the Director of Voice for Change England. And he will make the case for Brexit and the opportunities that it could bring for BAME communities.
Thank you. Okay. Brexit. It's a bit like, at the moment, that Eagles song, Hotel California. You know, the one that goes, you can check out anytime you want, but you can never, never leave. The essence for me of this debate is really not just a question of economics, but it's also a question of democracy and control. I remember, I think it was about 18 months ago, I was with Andy Gregg at a meeting called by Ukraine, the UK Race Equality Network that looks at European issues. And you know, we had a debate on the pros and cons of both the Leave and Remain arguments. And at the end of it, I remember we were asked a question about what we thought the outcome of the referendum would be. And I can remember saying to people that the Leave side would win by 55% to 45%. And there was an audible gasp of incredulity in the room. I wasn't that far out, was I? So what I was just trying to get at is an understanding that this is not just about economics. People have made lots of predictions. And I remember in the aftermath of the results, the Bank of England's governor also made predictions, all of which proved to be false. The idea that we actually were going to step into a situation of utter economic collapse was not what transpired. And I think that despite the Leave result enduring, we seem to have spent the last 2 years not addressing the question of what the arrangements and Leave is going to look like in terms of the positive sense, but seem to have been rerunning the referendum over and over and over again, to the point where even somebody like myself who takes a slightly perverse interest in these things is tired and bored, and I want them to get on with it. The problem I think we're now confronted with is a deal that Theresa May has negotiated in secret that neither satisfies the Remain side or Leavers. Indeed, the key questions of autonomy and taking back control, to a certain extent, have been left behind in this, and she's sold us apart, quite frankly. My view is informed by the fact that what people voted for in the referendum was very clear. Some of you will remember, as householders, we all got that little booklet. It's about £9 million spent on getting this booklet out to everybody's house, and it was very clear. The single market and the customs union would go. We now find ourselves in a situation where what's being proposed in the withdrawal agreement is that the customs union entraps us in a deal that will enable both the EU to continue to have a say over the economic arrangements of this country, but also, worse than that, the option, one of the big pluses in Brexit, being able to actually negotiate new bilateral trade agreements, is off the table, because that too will be regarded as out of order under this new direction. So, for me, the debate around Brexit is not simply about the question of what the economic impact will be, but it's also a question about how politics is conducted and how ordinary people are enabled to actually engage in the democratic space. The betrayal of Theresa May, I've got to be honest, didn't begin with the withdrawal agreement. The betrayal of this began the day after the vote was actually announced. Picture the scene of Tony Blair running to Europe to actually counter-brief against the interests of this country. In fact, that happened. Closely followed behind by Chuka Umunna and a whole host of others, including Anna Sabrin, who basically told Europe, look, don't concede anything. We can get these back in the European fold. And effectively, what we're witnessing at the moment is their wishes coming true. Lots of people have talked about, okay, I don't agree with leaving, but I respect the outcome of the vote. I don't think that's the case. I think a whole host of measures have been used to actually undermine and thwart that outcome. The starting point being that Leave voters are stupid, didn't know what they were voting for, didn't understand, aren't really articulate enough to grasp all the complexities of what went on there. It's a narrative that's been pushed quite hard, not just by the media, but also, even within the charity sector. It's quite obvious that when you go into meetings sometime, the first thing that people do when they're talking about Brexit is to denigrate Leave voters. There's an assumption that we're all the same and that we all voted the same way, which was to remain. And it's a very southern thing. Some of the best discussions I've had, interestingly enough, haven't been in London around Brexit. Talk to the Caribbean communities in the suburbs and on the outskirts of London. Go up to places like Merthyr Tydfil, go to Leeds. You get a completely different view of Brexit, a much more honest and open appreciation. The report that has been advanced, I think it's great, the information, but I just make two comments on it. One, it ignored the issue of the question of the democratic will of the people being exercised, and the democratic notion that people actually understood full well that the notion of leaving the EU wasn't going to be an easy thing, and certainly wasn't going to economically benefit people in the immediate period. But the fact of the matter is, many of those people that voted to leave, voted because actually the position that they're in, they had nothing to lose. So the idea of things actually getting worse, well, there's a conceptualization that people, I think, particularly in the South, need to understand, which is the differences in terms of levels of poverty that people are actually experiencing in different parts of the country. Leads them to a situation where actually things getting worse in itself isn't a big enough justification for not actually voting in the opposite direction. So the question of that's before us, I think where it leaves us is in a very difficult position. Theresa May said that she was going to unite the people through Brexit, and certainly she's achieved that. She has united both Leavers and Remainers in hating what she's actually proposing. So, good on you, Theresa. The option for me, looking at this, is not to despair. I think that this can still be improved, and I think that the objectives that people voted for in 2016 on the 23rd of June can still be won. But in order to do that, it requires quite radical thinking. And that's not just in relation to the question of Brexit, but it means asking, I think, very fundamental questions about the nature of democracy in our society and how it's exercised. If this deal goes through in terms of the final arrangements, it will damage the question of democracy in this country for a very long time to come. And the question of political arrangements of our political parties and of our establishment, of our media, I think will come under scrutiny and be challenged in a way that they've not seen before. The option then, for me, actually, given the paucity of options on the table, is actually to support a no deal. I think that's the only way that the interests of people who voted to leave the EU can be sustained. I'm happy to debate the issue, and I've noted that, as with many of the debates that I have attended in London, the weight of balance between those that supported the Leave side and the Remain side isn't quite equal. But don't worry about it, Andy. I'm used to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's a really interesting response to the paper, really interesting ideas. I have spent quite a lot of time outside of London with my work for the Joseph Branshaw Foundation, which is the organisation I work for before the GLA, and having some of those conversations with new voters about the impact that poverty has had on their vote. And those conversations are not that straightforward, but we can talk about that another time. It's not about what I think at this point. I think what we need to do now is hear from Nahir de la Silva, who is from the Latin American Women's Rights Service. And she's going to explain the risks that Brexit poses to non-EU women dependents of EU EEA partners in an abusive relationship, which is an issue that is certainly overlooked in the country.
Thank you. Good evening. First of all, I apologize for the delay. I think that the reason is very directed to the increase of the demand of the service, so I apologize for that. And yeah, I think that Brexit has a lot to do with that increase. So, well, my name is Nahir de la Silva. I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator on Employment Rights of the Latin American Women's Rights Service. That is an organization that last week we celebrated 35th anniversary. So 35 years of work, working with Latin American women in the country, issues regarding human rights, women's rights, and social justice for women in the country. So I guess that a lot of you are asking, like, why Latin American women are part of the debate. The reason is historical. So there are kind of, or I like to divide the migratory movement from Latin America to Europe in three groups. The first group, I'm going back to the 80s when Latin America was affected with dictatorship, civil wars. So a lot of people came specifically to the UK to seek asylum, refuge, and now they are British citizens. So that's the first group. The second group emigrated to Europe, specifically in 2000s, early 2000s, due to the economic crisis back home in Latin America. So they are now EU citizens. And due to the economic crisis, they mainly moved to countries such as Spain, Italy, and Portugal. And due to the economic crisis in there, they made a second migratory movement in here. And the third group, that is the group that I will focus today, is women with EU dependence, and this is a group of people that is somehow not included in the Brexit debate because of that. No? We talk about Brexit, we talk about Europeans, we talk about the rights of Europeans, and this group of people are dependents on, and they are living here because of the rights of the Europeans with whom they have a relationship or a family. So at the moment there is a lot of uncertainty, but one of the things that was published last June was the EU settlement scheme. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's a kind of piece of legislation that somehow established the requirements to seek a kind of continuity in this country. It sounds for me a little bit like a commercial, like a smooth and process, like a smooth and fast process, and easy to everybody to apply. It will be very easy, don't worry. You can do it with your mobile phone, take a selfie, and magic, like you have your papers. But unfortunately, in reality, in practice, it's not like that, because it's not that easy to get all the documentation that you need to apply to this. And regarding this third group of women we are talking today, they are EU dependents, so they depend on someone else. And that is fine. Sorry, that is fine. But when a woman is in an abusive relationship, that is when the problem starts. So unfortunately, some abusive partners use the immigration status as a form of violence, as a form of control. So starting from the very beginning, not a lot of women in this kind of relationship are registered, like the basic, registered with the GP. If they have children, she's not, like the partner is in charge of, registering, like schooling the children. The partner is the only person who is in the tenancy agreement. So somehow there are or the owner of the bank accounts. So there is a little things, a path that a woman follows to become invisible and more invisible and more invisible. So then when we talk about these cases, when we talk about regularization, when we talk about legalizing the status after after Brexit, it started to become more and more complicated, because how do you prove that you've been living here for the past 5 years if you are completely invisible? If you are not in touch with services, if you are not in touch, how do you prove that? And that is something that unfortunately, sorry, can you hear me? Yes, and that's the voice that is unfortunately not being part of the debate, the problem that is not being somehow considered. So I'm here now talking about Latin American women, but like us, there are many other women with this kind of visas. So yes, and that's an important part, yes, of the debate. And our main concern at the moment is like the proofs. How are they going to prove the residency, their continuous residency in this country? And our concern is that because this is a form of violence, then abusive partners will or make women believe that they are not entitled to seek this, to regularize this status, to continue living legally in this country, or they will wait until the last minute to submit their own application. And another problem in that application is that the European citizen can do it by themselves, and they can decide if they add or not the application of their partners. So it's completely up to the partners to include them or not. And as you may be aware, like in a situation of violence, it will affect, it will have an impact. It's something that they will, unfortunately, that they will use against them. So what can we do? Yes, I'm very thankful for this space to raise awareness that this is a group that is like from very marginalized from all the debates. Like I'm also EU dependent. I didn't receive any booklet. I couldn't vote. So like my voice was not in the debate at all. I'm just following the flow, and like me, many other women too. So yes, having our voices and taking into consideration how violence and trauma works in a person, how it operates. Yes, and I hope that somehow with all this collective work we can do the system to become more flexible towards and to consider these kind of cases. And when I mean flexibility, it means like the proof of residency. How can we all together make yes, our voices be heard by the government to say okay, this will be hard to prove. We can do it. We can provide other alternatives. I know that at the moment there are many tests of the scheme. We really tried to take our cases, but they were not accepted. Only European cases are accepted, not third country nationals dependents. So yes, it's a hard battle, but I'm sure that somehow we will reach a point of agreement and yes, the improvement of the conditions. Thank you.
Lots of light thank you so much for that presentation. It was really interesting, and it definitely is an area that never gets included in the political debates. I'm really grateful to you for raising it. So our final speaker this evening is Sarah Tamaki from Roma Support Group, and she is going to comment on the potential impact of Brexit on the Roma community.
Okay. Hello, and thank you for having me here tonight. So, my name is Sarah, and I work for Roma Support Group, which is a small London-based charity organization that works with Roma, refugee, and migrant communities from Eastern Europe. We work primarily with Polish, Slovak, and Romanian Roma, and try to basically improve their situation in the UK post-migration. But before I go any further, I think it's helpful sometimes to give a bit of background on who the Roma are, a bit about the situation of Roma in Eastern Europe and what brought Roma to the UK. So the term Roma refers to an ethnic minority group that has its origins originally in India. Migration began out of India about 1,000 years ago, and now there are Roma communities throughout the world, though the populations are concentrated primarily in Eastern Europe, with also large Roma migrant communities throughout countries in Western Europe. And now, in their countries of origin in Eastern Europe, many Roma people face extreme discrimination. They're attending segregated schools, like Roma-only classes. Sometimes Roma children are placed in special needs classes despite having no special educational needs. Roma are often denied access to health services on the basis of their ethnic identity, and as well, there have been cases where Roma women have been forcibly sterilized in Eastern European countries. Roma also are commonly, they live in segregated accommodation as well, outside the reach of public services. And so, in light of this extreme situation of poverty and marginalization in Eastern Europe, Roma have come to the UK first as asylum seekers after the fall of communism, opening of borders. So Roma first came in that wave of migration, and since the 2004 and 2007 EU accessions, Roma have come as more economic migrants or following family connections. And so our service users predominantly report that their situation in the UK is much, much better than it was in their countries of origin. They're able to blend in. They're not visible as being Roma to everyone. They're not followed around shops to see if they're going to steal something. They're able to kind of gain a sense of social acceptance in the UK. But with the Brexit vote, all of that has come into question, and we're very concerned within Roma Support Group that many Roma people could lose their right to legally reside in the UK based on the current settlement scheme application. and its inaccessibility to many members of the Roma community. So to kind of understand the issues here, it helps sometimes to think about the settlement scheme application step by step. So first, in order to make this application, people will have to pay a £65 application fee. And I know that doesn't sound like too much, really, and that's what the Home Office has told us multiple times. But for Roma community members living perhaps paycheck to paycheck, that could be financially breaking for them. As well, many Roma community members have very large families. If you have, say, 5, 6 children and need to pay for an application for all of them, then that also is going to place an extreme financial burden on the people from Roma communities. Then there's the issue of the accessibility of the application itself. And so for Roma communities, many have low levels of digital literacy. And given that this application first requires people to download an app to their phones, scan their passport with this app, and then proceed to fill in an online application form, and they're simply not going to be able to do that without support for people who say, they have a computer, but they have no idea how to use it, they don't know what things mean. And then there's also the issue that the application is English only. And now, some Roma community members do speak English, but not universally. And many are not able to read English to the extent that they could understand all of the questions in this application form and would be able to complete the application by themselves. And so, with these combined issues, Roma people are placed in a position where they will absolutely need support to complete their applications, but that support largely for many members of the Roma community will not be available. And so this could put them in a position where, after the application deadline on the 30th of June 2021, these people could be in a state of being essentially illegal in the UK. And we're looking for a way to overcome this, but at the moment, these answers are not forthcoming. So those are some of the main issues.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for some really interesting contributions from our panel. We now have 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So I'd like to invite you all to put any questions that you have to our panellists, but also to our research team. If you have questions about the research itself, I'm going to take in batch 3, depending on how many hands go up, first of all. Gentlemen, second one.
My name is Tenny, one of the members of the board of ROTA. This is a question for Kunle, if there will be others, substitute questions. In essence, what is your, why are you in favor of Brexit, in essence?
I think basically there are 4 reasons for me. The question of sovereignty, getting back control over our laws, not being subject to European courts, and essentially being able to develop independent trade relations with those parts of the world where trade is actually now beginning to actually boom. I think that the question of a 2-tier immigration system that operates through the relationship between the EU and the rest of the world has worked against the interests of non-EU migrants, in particular those from not only Latin America, but also from Africa, and more recently, as we've seen, with the Windrush generation. And then, I think finally, principally, as somebody who's also worked in Europe as well, apart from being a Brit, I'm also a registered Catalan resident. And I've always been of the view that just because you are pro-EU does not make you pro-European, and likewise, just because you are anti-EU does not mean that you aren't pro-European. But we have a different sense of what it is to be pro-European, I think, as leaders, and that means engagement with people and democratic arrangements on their own terms, not just through a bureaucracy, which is increasingly becoming federal in its own way.
Okay, what's your evidence that everything you've said for pro-Brexit, things will change and improve?
My evidence is, well, if you look at the question of immigration, as was mentioned in the introduction, there's a hardening line around immigration which is coming from the EU. And I think it's interesting that the only area...
No, I'm not talking about EU. Okay, let's assume you've achieved you've achieved Brexit. What is the evidence that you talked about sovereignty, taking back control, that things will be different? Like, okay, this is what how we were under the control of Europe. Now, this is the freedom we've gained as a result of Brexit.
With all due respect, I can't actually evidence something that hasn't happened. That's a contradiction.
Well, that's the point. Brexit...
But I can actually argue a point in terms of giving people the space to develop new relationships and new ideas in terms of how democratic practice can go forward. What you're looking for is a determined outcome. I can't give you that. What I can say is that the will of the people needs to be respected, and that's a basic concept. The nation state is the basic unit of democracy. I think we've all got to accept that.
So really, you're...
Sorry, I'm going to have to take chair's privilege, because I think this discussion is brilliant, I really do. But I think I'd like to just open it up to other questions so that we can continue the discussion. So have you got any other questions to put to the panel? Okay.
Well, I'm probably slightly controversial, but given all of the stats, all of the history that we've seen over the past, I think it's probably about 7 years, it's been going on, maybe a little bit longer. Does anybody not have the suspicion that actually the intention is to make things difficult in the UK for people who are migrants or not? Thank you. For people who are migrants or perhaps are not indigenous to the UK, sometimes it does feel that way, and I think there's a lot of evidence mounting up to suggest that that's so. And if that's the case, all of these stopgaps that we're putting in and looking at the issues that are probably going to arise after Brexit, is there really going to be much support to actually move those things forward without community intervention? Kind of mixed up question.
Yeah.
You'll understand where I'm coming from.
I definitely agree, as mentioned before, the strong racist elements within the Brexit campaign. Again, distinguishing it from the voters themselves, but definitely that was an intention behind that. And as for support, I regularly said we're often very bored of Brexit. I've been arguing about it for the past 2 years, and there is a desperate need to move on to other things and address the issues that you just mentioned. But right now, the government's spending, it's got 7,000 civil servants working on Brexit, plans for 9,000 more, it's in the budget, and then 300 extra to deal with border issues. Not doctors, not nurses, not teachers, not investing in youth services, not investing in the NHS. Yes, the actual impetus to actually address those problems won't be there. Can I also address some previous points?
Absolutely, please do.
The idea that it would break, that stopping Brexit in any way would break democracy. Couldn't I mention that if we allow this deal to go through, it would break the very idea of democracy? In the sense that yes, because it would be directly against what many of the people who voted for Brexit wanted, but we can't impute intentions to people in a sort of hard way like that. For example, the question said, do you wish to leave the European Union? This deal makes us leave the European Union. Now, if that isn't making people happy, if that's not what people wanted, then we should have asked a different question. We should have asked, do you want a specific deal? I mean, that's the whole point of the people's vote. I mean, I often use the example of the Good Friday Agreement. When they signed that, they sent a copy of the full text of the Good Friday Agreement to every single voter, and then had a referendum on it. Because they got to see the deal they were signing before they signed it. That is true informed consent. That's true democracy. The reason why people aren't happy with the Brexit we're getting is because we signed it, and then they wrote the terms last week. Of course people aren't happy. Now, as for the idea that there could have been a better Brexit, it comes down to the Good Friday Agreement. Let's say there was, a soft way of saying it, there was a disagreement over whether or not Northern Ireland should be part of the UK or United Island of Ireland. That's the essence of the Good Friday Agreement. And it basically creates a halfway house. Northern Ireland officially part of the UK, but there's an open border, no customs checks, no physical infrastructure at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, the moment we start having different laws to the rest of the EU, the moment we take back control, the moment we start importing products which do not meet the standards of the EU, such as the beef we plan to get from America, is the EU simply going to allow any lorry to pass between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? Out of consumer protection, they will need to check lorries across between the two. The only way we avoid that hard border is by having the same laws on either side of the border. Now, if we have the same laws as the EU, but have left the institutions of the EU, what does that mean as for our control? It means we are bound by rules of which we have zero control anymore. Right now, the UK has 73 of the 750 members of the European Parliament. That means we have 3 times the voting weight of the average EU country. We're about to give that up in favour of having no control at all, and there was never any Brexit agreement possible that could have avoided that. But that's what we're getting. The question was, do you want to leave the EU? It wasn't, do you want more control? It wasn't, do you want a better NHS? Now, yes, when we go to those areas that voted to leave, when we asked them what they wanted, it was more control, better NHS, and to be better off. But that wasn't the question they were asked. Now, this deal means we have less control. The British Medical Association says it's bad for the NHS, as to the Royal College of Nurses, Royal College of Midwives, and it's for me being better off. Economically, no. We've damaged our relationship with our closest countries, the countries that are physically closest to us. And as for making trade outside of Europe, in any trade negotiation, your leverage is based on the size of the market that you have to offer. So we trade right now as a market of 500 million people. Now we'll be trading as the UK alone. And the example I often give is, in the negotiations between the EU and the US, they have an agreement whereby nothing can happen that would damage the nationalisation of public health services. So the NHS is protected. Compare that with what's happening with the UK and the US post-Brexit. Donald Trump's health advisor says that they plan to use the post-Brexit trade negotiations to make the NHS pay more for drugs so that American companies pay less. And Theresa May has refused to rule out selling off parts of the NHS to America. We are weaker on our own than we are as a group.
Okay, let's take another question, please.
This is to Kunle, and it's about immigration and UK policy. Kunle, the suggestion for your argument is that actually we will have more liberal immigration policy once we leave Europe. But going back to history and before we joined Europe, British policy have always been a racist policy when it comes to immigration. Do you honestly think they're going to change their minds? As it is now, if you're a young Australian in New Zealand, you can come and live here for up to 2 years and more. You can't do that if you're from Africa or South America, etc. And I'm sure Rome people, once we leave, if we finally leave, will have similar barriers. So if you're poor, if you're black of colour, you will really have much more barriers that are much more restrictive to you. And do you really believe that's going to change, is the question?
We'll take another couple of questions first. Please getting most of the questions at the moment. So if I take 2 more, so the lady there and then the lady.
Okay, mine is more of a comment, which is if society breaks down, at what point would democracy continue? Because we're just going to see for the next 10, 15 years of all sides actually battling. And the health system, education system, families are going to be uprooted, and it's going to be general turmoil. And like we've also identified from the discussions here, you do have people who couldn't vote, because what I see in this is because some people that are able to vote, voted. And if I'm waiting for my rights to remain, and I couldn't vote a day after, and some people voted for my future, have you really taken that into account? How about the young people and the larger society? So I suspect that we might actually be seeing the breakdown of democracy that you so love.
Thank you. Probably just to follow up on what Ali was just talking about. when you're talking about the Roma community or the dependent, this whole scheme, how much do they pay? £65? Compare that to somebody who is coming from outside the EU, just for settlement. The application, if you're applying within, is £2,000, £389. Then when you start putting the dependents, it's even more than that. So can you imagine? I suspect that they pegged it at 65, because if it had been any higher, the other EU members would have just said this is not acceptable. So as it is to me, just using that tiny example, it is a way that if you're part of a union, there are certain things you're not just going to just decide on a whim, because you have to think about the consequences. But they can do whatever they want as far as setting the fees for those who are non-EU, because it's a way of making money and they don't really care. Bringing in the Commonwealth, where is the Commonwealth as far as post-Brexit is concerned? Because as it is, the UK and the Commonwealth, the relationship is skewed. I don't see anything much Commonwealth countries benefit by having this relationship. How does this factor in, and what are they going to be using that space for? And I strongly suspect that it's going to get worse, because I don't believe that they are going to start caring about race and equality, because as it is, they are not investing in any of those issues, they're actually divesting. So where are we going to stand as far as that is concerned? The Equality and Human Rights Commission, it is not well funded. So how are we going to progress on some of these issues? And you're right, why is it that we're not given a full document when we're asked to vote? I voted to remain. I live in Norwich. I voted to remain, and I would have thought, and I still want to remain for my own personal reasons and things that I feel will contribute to the society. But I'm very worried about this leave and the will of the voters and that kind of thing, because it was very close vote and people were not fully informed.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask each of the panellists to respond to which of the three questions they feel are relevant. So we've got an issue about the breakdown in democracy, whether or not the focus on immigration is likely to change after Brexit, and a discussion about the difference in the fees that EU and non-EU citizens pay in the settlement deal. So I'm going to start with you. Sorry for the feedback.
So regarding the breakdown in democracy, I cannot tell, of course. But what I can see now is we all became an immigration officer. So since there is this immigration act that allows everybody to ask you for your passport. If you want to rent a room, you need to provide, your landlord or your landlady will ask you for your passport. Your employee will ask you. If you want to open a bank account, they ask you for your passport. So now it seems that everybody can somehow, we have all the knowledge to understand the different visas, the different permits, and that's dangerous, because what does that mean? That if you don't look as you should look, or if your name sounds a little bit different, you will have problems. And that's the thing that we are seeing in laws with some of our service users. People don't want to rent to people who are coming just recently from Europe, because they don't know, and one of the landlords was very honest and said, I really don't know if I should rent a room to you. I don't know. So I won't do it. And that's the kind of situation. So if we are going somehow to a breakdown of democracy, I don't know, but yes, somehow, communities are becoming suspicious against the other ones. So what is that? What is happening to all of us, and what is this environment? So it's, yes, the hostile environment policies, but you can really feel it, in people on the street, kind of everybody against that, everybody suspicious, and yes, it's very concerning. Regarding the fees, the Latin American, so there are two issues regarding the fees and why are expensive. Of course, if you compare it with third country nationals applying to visas or citizenship, the fees are like much more expensive. But then for EU Latin American migrant women, the main sectors of work are the cleaning, the hospitality and domestic work sectors, and there are sectors that are very poorly regulated. Some of them, they are not even earning the national minimum wage. So when we talk about paying 65 pounds for that plus all the dependents, it means a lot of money, even though it doesn't sound like it is. And for some women, it's a decision of buying food for the family or paying the fees to regularize the status. And when we are talking about dependents, like the 65 pounds for an abusive partner, and that's a hard decision. And how, because we are talking not all of them work, they are very dependent of the abuser. So, yes, at the end of the day, 65 pounds, it makes a lot of difference. And yes, it's expensive. Thank you.
Yes, so I think I'll respond to the question related to immigration policy and will immigration policy become more liberal somehow post-Brexit. And I mean, to kind of consider this, I have to consider my personal experience. So if you can tell, I'm also not from here. And I came to this country as a PhD student, and I'm currently trying to complete my PhD and find a job. What I found is that it is near impossible to find any kind of job. Every time I look at something and every time I see, oh, that job's perfect for me, like I have all the qualifications, I have all the knowledge for it, I've experienced that area, but to say at the bottom of the application, we don't sponsor visas. And so if that's the current situation for someone who is not from the UK, from third country, I suppose, I can only imagine that when similar immigration rules are applied to people who are from EU countries as well, that they will be subject to the same restrictions, and that people who, UK citizens say they would like in this country will in fact be excluded from this country as well.
After globalization and breakdown of democracy. Right now, it is our birthright to live, work, and love in 31 countries across Europe. That's our right. And it's free. You can go to, France is literally 20 megabus away, and you can get yourself a job. No discrimination, no visa applications. Compare that with what would happen post-Brexit. Right now, it's a Tory policy that post-Brexit, our immigration policy will mean that you have to be earning at least £30,000 a year in order to come here. One of my first jobs was working in a hotel in France, doing everything from customer service to cleaning toilets. I was not earning £30,000. And so we've created, and because the joint statement that came out today says that any future mobility will be based on full reciprocity, that means that we've created a very elitist system via Brexit. I mean, quite simply, it means that in order to go to another EU country, which is the easiest places for us to get to because they're physically closest, you need to be earning the top brackets. That's what ending free movement does, and that's what Brexit will do. Regardless of whether or not you voted for Brexit to end free movement, that's what Brexit is doing. As for faith in democracy, we've been touring the country as our future choice, going specifically to the areas voted to leave. Now, the reason why, you can pretty much trace the outline on a map as to where the areas voted for Brexit. They're the areas that the political system has not been working for. Places like the North East, places like Wales. Now, what they need is investment in their areas to actually create the jobs that they need. The investment to create the transport infrastructure so that they can have thriving, independent northern economies, not HS2, so they can keep being dependent on London. That's what they actually need. And for 40 years, they've been completely neglected because if you take Sunderland, for example, Labour's always going to win there, Tories are never going to lose, so there's no political incentive to actually do anything over there. But they need things to get better. Now, if things get worse for them, if they end up with less control, their faith in democracy, after they finally thought we might be able to make a change, something positive, after we've been ignored for so long, they'll lose complete faith in democracy. Now, right now, there's a factory in Nissan, this is just an example, Nissan factory in Sunderland, 75% of the cars they make go to mainland Europe. And there are 35,000 jobs across the North East that depend on that factory. And the reason why the Japanese chose that location is because anything made in this country is automatically legal across Europe. So 35,000 jobs in an area that voted for Brexit because they were desperate for change, they're the ones who get screwed by Brexit itself. So not only will Brexit voters be angry, especially on the sort of deal that we're dealing with right now, but they'll be the ones most economically hit, and also the people who voted Remain, which demographically speaking, due to age issues, will be in a majority in the next couple of years. They'll be angry as well, and they'll lose faith in democracy because they voted for something to try and shape their futures, and they were outvoted. And the future, and we'll have a majority come that time. And I see, if we end up in a situation where both sides of this debate are deeply angry with the outcome, I'm very, very scared as to where we go.
Okay, I'm going to respond to 2 points. The immigration one. First of all, in terms of liberalisation, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the shift would actually give us the opportunity to control our immigration policy. And that's a different thing. I think there's still an argument to be had in terms of how liberal our immigration policy actually could be. But the question of the distinction between EU migrants and non-EU migrants could be addressed for the first time in a very long time. I think the hardening of lines around immigration is actually happening right across Europe, and that's got nothing to do with Brexit. In fact, in February of 2016, 5 of the EU member states actually shut down and did not allow migrants to come across their borders. Specifically, 2 of them, Austria and Hungary, are well known. And indeed, as was introduced earlier, even Hillary Clinton now is coming out and basically arguing a much harder line on immigration. Obama in America actually was responsible for deporting more Mexicans than any other previous president. So the question of the hardening of lines around immigration is not distinct or unique to Brexit. Indeed, immigration has been an issue for the political class in this country going back 30 and 40 years. We marked this year with the 50 years of the Race Relations Act. The symbiotic relationship between the Race Relations Acts and immigration is there to be seen. I'm sure there are some very bright people in this room who can tell you all about it. But more specifically, the hypocrisy that somehow the EU is some kind of liberal institution around immigration. I remember the discussion around Katie Hopkins when she talked about cockroaches being left to drown in the Mediterranean. And we forget that it was the EU policy that actually decided to reduce the number of rescue boats to leave people to drown in the Mediterranean in order to discourage migrants coming across. I have no illusions about British immigration policy and the way that's been used and manipulated. But I do think there are many illusions about the progressive nature of the EU and its position on immigration. In terms of democracy, I think I'll just be very clear. The decisions that ordinary people make in a binary election where people felt for the first time in a very long while that they can actually determine the outcome of the policy, to actually see that betrayed leaves us in a kind of vacuum where clearly people will come to the conclusion that you cannot actually make things happen. The 700,000 people who came out on the second referendum march, let's not forget, 1.5 million came out on the anti-Iraq demonstration, and this government of Tony Blair was not moved. The conclusions people draw increasingly are not going to be simply that we let things continue, but I think the emergence, probably of new political formations, is likely to be the outcome of this. So I think that there's definitely a vacuum that is going to emerge that will need to be filled.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like you to, can I ask you all to thank all of our panellists and also this discussion is as divisive as the referendum, as the ongoing political debate, and clearly as reflected in the discussion that we've had on this table today. I'd like to thank you though for giving up your evening to come and listen to some really interesting debates. Thank you to the panellists. I've been really infused by the discussion, and I know this will all continue into the future, at least up until March and on past March and for some time to come. So thank you all for your time. Thank you.
Please do stay for some sandwiches and some wine and some soft drinks as well.